In this episode of Plants of the Gods, ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin walks us through the history of the green fairy, absinthe. From Picasso and Van Gogh to Hemingway and Oscar Wilde, consumption of this anise-flavored spirit has yielded some of the greatest art and literature of our time, beginning with its roots as healing wormwood tea to the hallmark substance of the French Belle Epoque. Today, we'll journey through the infamous yet inspiring story of absinthe.
Today we want to talk about absinthe, which is the ultimate ideogen. Welcome back to Plants of the Gods, Season 3. In this series, we've talked about psychedelics and their relation to both healing and spirituality, and have also emphasized their impact on enhancing creativity, an aspect often overlooked in the literature on mind-altering plants and fungi. Remember that the Roman poet Horace said that, quote, "No poem was ever written by a drinker of water." If entheogens release the god within, and hallucinogens generate hallucinations, what can we call a substance which fosters creativity and generates new and creative ideas? My friend Abigail Wright coined the term ideogen, and probably no biological product has fostered more art and literature than absinthe, the subject of today's episode. It must be considered the ideogen par excellence, but with a deadly subtext, as we shall see as we examine the history, impact, birth, death, and rebirth of absinthe. Absinthe will be forever associated with the themes of European creativity and decadence of the 1890s, which has been called the belle epoque, the beautiful epoch, when the art and literature of France dominated the world. Regina Nadelson wrote, quote, "Absinthe has a history rich in carnal and narcotic connotation." Barnaby Conrad, the author of a classic book on absinthe, said that the history of absinthe is one of, quote, "murder, madness, and despair." Another writer said that the mere mention of the name evokes, quote, "thoughts of narcotic intrigue, euphoria, eroticism, and decadent sensuality." Philbeau, author of the Book of Absinthe, wrote, quote, "The history of absinthe has some sobering themes: addiction, ruin, and mortality." Baker detailed the impact of absinthe on the art world. He wrote, quote, "Absinthe was the green-eyed muse. Absinthe was, quote, the genius of those who didn't have any genius of their own, and the death of any real genius for those who did. Absinthe was the potion that inspired the passions of the world's greatest poets and painters. Picasso, Toulouse Lautrec, Edward Degas, Paul Verlaine, Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud, Oscar Wilde, and Vincent van Gogh sought solace and inspiration and creativity from this fiery elixir. The British poet Ernest claimed that, quote, "whiskey and beer are for fools, but absinthe is for poets." He also said, quote, "Absinthe makes the tart grow fonder." French playwright Alfred Jarry believed that absinthe was, quote, "the essence of life." Hemingway himself labeled absinthe, quote, "idea-changing liquid alchemy." Oscar Wilde wrote that a glass of absinthe is as poetical as anything in the world. And the greatest quote about absinthe was also from Oscar Wilde. So listen in. Quote, "After the first glass, you see things as you wish they were. After the second, you see things as they are not. And finally, after the third glass, you see things as they really are. And that is the most horrible thing in the world." Absinthe is a liquor infused with oil of wormwood, a member of the daisy family. The oil is extracted from the leaves, flowers, and stems of the two species of the genus Artemisia, Artemisia absinthium, which is common wormwood, and Roman wormwood, which is Artemisia pontica. Wormwood has long been used medicinally in many parts of the world for a variety of ailments. The alcoholic content of absinthe can reach 75%, which is astonishingly high. Wine is typically around 12%. Rum is only 40%, meaning absinthe can be almost twice as potent. The history of absinthe, that is the history of medicinal wormwood, stretches at least as far back as the Egypt of the pharaohs. The Ebers Papyrus, which was covered in our episode on the ethnobotany of wine, is the ancient medical papyrus from 1600 BC. It recommended wormwood as a stimulant and a tonic, an antiseptic vermifuge, and a remedy for fevers. Hippocrates, the ancient Greek father of medicine, employed wormwood for treating anemia and rheumatism. The ancient Greeks believed that wormwood was first given to the legendary centaur Chiron by the goddess Artemis, which is why the genus is known as Artemisia. Paracelsus, the Renaissance alchemist and physician, who famously claimed that, quote, the dose makes the poison, rediscovered the Egyptian practice of using wormwood against fevers, particularly malaria. Remember that point because I'll come back to it at the end of this episode. The transition from wormwood tea to absinthe liquor began with an alcoholic drink prepared in Switzerland at the close of the 17th century. Absinthe drinking, however, received a great boost with the French colonial wars in Algeria from 1830 to the middle of that century. French troops were issued a ration of absinthe to ward off malaria and other fevers and to kill bacteria and protozoans in their drinking water. So effective was this prophylaxis that it became part of French army life from the Caribbean to French Indochina. When the French soldiers brought absinthe with them back to France after the wars, absinthe became associated with victorious veterans, and according to the Oxford Book of Spirits, it therefore acquired a rakish appeal. And it soon became popular with the artists, particularly with the painters and poets of Paris. The presentation of absinthe in bars became part of the mystique and the appeal. A shot of absinthe was poured into a glass, then a sugar cube was placed on a specially designed slotted spoon over the glass to sweeten the bitter taste, and the cube in some cases was lit on fire to caramelize the sugar. It also created a wonderful visual. When the water was poured over the sugar and magically turns the color from crystal green to milky yellow, it's a very appealing sight. The drink was nicknamed the Green Fairy, as the intoxicating liquid was thought to have hallucinogenic properties and also appeared to have fairy wings dancing in the glass when the water dripped in with the sugar from the spoon atop the glass of absinthe. Another factor that contributed to the popularity of absinthe was the ravaging of the French vineyards by phylloxera aphids in the 1850s, which increased the price of wine and therefore made absinthe more appealing and relatively more affordable. Absinthe will be forever associated with the explosive flowering of art and literature in Paris during the last 10 years of the 1800s. The period is widely known as the Belle Epoque, as I said, but has also been termed, quote, the absinthe decade. Paris then teemed with mind-altering substances, and not just the usual wine and cognac. Strawberries soaked in ether were a popular dessert, and cocaine and opium were gaining popularity. Morphine injections were all the rage with wealthy women. Alexander Dumas complained that morphine was fast becoming, quote, the absinthe for women. But author Philbeau disagreed. The real absinthe for women, he said, was absinthe. Absinthe became so popular that Parisian cafes and clubs specialized in serving the Green Fairy. The great French painter Edouard Manet's famous depiction of the absinthe drinker, completed in 1859, was actually an alcoholic rad-picker. Nonetheless, he had a strange dignity as painted by Manet. The painting, unpopular at first, was later proclaimed a masterpiece. The great painter Edward Degas' famous painting, L'Absinthe, was similarly dismissed at the outset, only later to become one of the most famous paintings of all time. It is considered a brilliant evocation of l'heure verte, the green hour, at a Montmartre café. Perhaps the strangest figure in the history of absinthe is one of the strangest figures in all of Western history. Alfred Jarry was an incredibly bizarre creature. He was exceedingly short, under 5 feet, spoke in a peculiar manner, and often adorned himself with a cape and enormous stovepipe hat. He sometimes wore women blouses and pink turbans. He lived in a tiny room in Paris, and the spiral staircase leading up to his digs was decorated with handprints of blood on the walls. The room was draped in black velvet and filled with owls, which were his symbol, and other religious paraphernalia. He devoured absinthe, sometimes combined with ether, in appalling, prodigious quantities, often with disastrous results. He loudly and unceasingly proclaimed his aversion to water, not unlike the great American comedian and fellow alcoholic W.C. Fields, who famously asked, quote, "How can you drink water? Fish fuck in it." End of quote. Jarry often carried a pistol, a combustible mix of alcohol and firearms. He got into trouble for trying to shoot a cigar out of a man's mouth in a bar. While attempting to shoot the tops off a series of champagne bottles at a garden party, he was accosted by a woman who worried he might hit one of her children. He replied, monstrously, quote, "If that should ever happen, madame, we should be happy to help you make new ones." End of quote. He was literally a colorful figure, as I said, sometimes appearing in a woman's blouse and a pink turban. He's said to have painted his hair green, once painted his face green, and rode through town on his bicycle in honor of absinthe, and undoubtedly under its influence at the time. He deeply influenced fellow absinthe drinkers, Henry Toulouse Lautrec and Pablo Picasso, before dying of tuberculosis and cirrhosis of the liver at the early age of 32. Henri Toulouse Lautrec was yet another famous absinthe drinker from the belle epoque of Paris. He immortalized the music halls, the theaters, the cafes, the drunks, and the prostitutes of Paris around Montmartre and in the Moulin Rouge through his drawings, paintings, and poster design. Fellow artist Gustave Moreau analyzed Lautrec's paintings as, quote, entirely painted in absinthe. Like his pal Alfred Jarry, Lautrec was a notoriously heavy drinker, and his preferred cocktail was a lethal combo of absinthe and brandy. And absinthe appeared in many of Toulouse-Lautrec's paintings. Lautrec was famed for saying, quote, "One should drink a little bit, but often." To facilitate this, he usually carried a walking stick that you can see in paintings and drawings and on display in the Toulouse-Lautrec Museum. The cane was hollow and filled with a half-liter of absinthe, and the walking stick also contained a tiny drinking glass. When he hosted dinner parties, Toulouse-Lautrec put a goldfish in a water jug to express his disdain for drinking water, much like his buddy Albert Jarry. He excused his titanic intake of absinthe by exclaiming, quote, "I assure you, I can drink safely because I'm so close to the ground already." But excessive drinking and fast living took a toll. Not only was he an alcoholic, but he contracted syphilis as well and passed away at the age of 36. One of the commonalities about many of these artists who became such devoted devotees of absinthe is that they died young from alcoholism, poor nutrition, and hard living. Toulouse-Lautrec is probably the one that introduced that other hallucinatory painting, Vincent van Gogh, to the pleasures of both Parisian brothels and absinthe. In 1887, Toulouse-Lautrec did a pastel portrait of Van Gogh with a glass of absinthe in front of him. Vincent van Gogh also ended up as one of absinthe's most spectacular victims. His weird perspectives and extraordinary creative use of colors, particularly greens and yellows, is often attributed to his consumption of the green fairy. The same year as he was painted by Toulouse-Lautrec, Van Gogh painted his own still life of absinthe in a water decanter, and Van Gogh had another equally famous drinking partner in Paris, Paul Gauguin. Van Gogh's mental decline in alcoholism reached a point where he was drinking turpentine as well. Van Gogh committed suicide at the age of 37, another premature death that had to be blamed in part on absinthe. Pablo Picasso, the most famous artist of the 20th century, was also intrigued and inspired by absinthe. Absinthe featured prominently in several classic paintings from his Blue period, from about 1901 to 1903. This was during absinthe's artistic heyday in the cafes of Paris. Absinthe also figured in his later Cubist works in both paintings and sculpture. Philbeau, in the Book of Absinthe, wrote, quote, "Picasso's Glass of Absinthe is a classic work of analytical cubism, although the viewer would be hard-pressed to say where the glass of absinthe actually is." End of quote. The greatest writer of the 20th century, Ernest Hemingway, wrote persuasively and evocatively about absinthe's merits as a drink. Hemingway's love of absinthe was not denied when France banned absinthe because he was drinking it in Spain and then Cuba. His most memorable tribute to absinthe is featured in his greatest novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. He wrote, quote, "One cup of absinthe took the place of the evening papers, of all the old evenings in cafes, of all chestnuts, of being blue. One is able to read, relax, in the evening of all the things he had enjoyed and forgotten that come back to him when he tasted that opaque, bitter, tongue-numbing, brain-warming, stomach-warming, idea-changing liquid alchemy." Hemingway claimed that whiskey with water may be clean and warming, but it does not curl around the inside of you the way that absinthe does. In talking about absinthe addiction and the 20th century ban, it's important to understand the acronym ABV. ABV means alcohol by volume. Absinthe was historically bottled at what's called 45 to 74% ABV, although some versions may even been as high as 90%. This is astonishingly high when you consider that wine is just 12% ABV and rum is 40%. And if you double ABV, you get the proof number. So 74% ABV is 150 proof. So many people were severely addicted to absinthe by the end of the 19th century that a term was coined to describe it, absinthism. Absinthism was described in the medical texts in the 19th century as a separate type of alcoholism, supposedly causing extensive neurological damage. Because absinthe was portrayed as a dangerous, addictive, and psychoactive drug, by 1915 it had been banned in the U.S. and much of Europe. The final impetus for the ban came with the run-up to the First World War. The French were afraid that the barbaric, beer-swilling Teutons, that is, the Germans, would annihilate the decadent and feeble absinthe-swilling French. The temperance movement and absinthe competitors in the wine industry had also advocated for the absinthe ban. However, current thinking is that absinthe is not really any more dangerous than ordinary spirits as long as it's not drunk to excess because of the incredibly high alcohol content. According to the Oxford Book of Spirits, these health concerns have been solidly debunked by modern scientific analysis and historical research. In other words, that all the terrible effects of absinthism were due to the fact that it was just a very highly alcoholic beverage. Revival of absinthe began in the 1990s when people realized that much of the claims of the danger of absinthe were really overblown. Around the year 2000, I had the opportunity to visit Pompeii, near Naples, the Roman city that was destroyed in the eruption of the volcano Vesuvius in 79 AD. As an ethnobotanist, I'm trained to read a landscape, or try and read a landscape, figure what's going on ecologically and what happened in the past. In one of the houses, one of the destroyed Roman villas, I saw a small garden, and in that garden was growing wormwood, which of course is the source of absinthe. Now, Rome was in part destroyed by malaria. Malaria often swept into the city of Rome and the surrounding regions from the Pontine marshes to the southeast of Rome. One of the Roman treatments of malaria was wormwood. Fast forward to 2015, 2,000 years after the eruption of Vesuvius, more or less, and a Chinese pharmaceutical chemist by the name of Tu Yu won the Nobel Prize for finding a compound in wormwood, artemisinin, that was an effective treatment for malaria. So once again, the creative, the spiritual, and the healing are combined in yet another plant of the gods.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, we will leave Europe as we learn about the history and impact of absinthe in Dr. Mark Plotkin's hometown, New Orleans, and the birth of rock and roll.